Okay, so I've become fascinated with a construct that you've been fleshing out lately, the cyborg theocracy. How do we draw lines around this thing for people? What is it? What is the cyborg theocracy?
Well, I should say I didn't coin the term. It's somebody else's meme. The MO with a meme is that you meme first and then you ask questions later. It always takes a lot longer to figure out what you mean by a meme than it does to just coin it in the first place. I mean, if you think H.R. Geiger and you think robot-human crossovers and you think Battlestar Galactica and you think, COVID lockdowns and you think vaccine passports and you think transhumanist feminism and you think pod life and you think live in the pod and eat the bugs and you think digital surveillance and you think OnlyFans and you think
The metaverse.
Yeah.
Biohacking. The infinite scroll.
Yeah. It's kind of a vibe.
Yes. You've just set up a mood board for it.
Right. Okay. So there's your mood board.
Yeah.
So if you start there and then work backwards to the theory that unites all of these things. I mean, this is something which I suppose I've been fleshing it out over the last little while, and I guess I've just been trying to think that through in slightly more linear terms.
Yeah.
Starting from the mood board and working backwards to something which feels a bit more coherent.
I really like that because I see what you see, but from a different angle.
Well, when I talk about theology, what I mean is talking about morals, talking about the moral order which governs how we live together as people or individually.
Which inevitably has a metaphysic attached
Absolutely,
to it.
absolutely. You can't have a moral order without some fundamental metaphysical premises.
Yeah.
I mean, the Christian theology has sort of basic beliefs about what the world is, which you can't prove or disprove rationally. You just have to believe them or not. Mm. So for example, we live in a world that's created by God. We're all God's creations. We're tainted by original sin, but our life is amenable to salvation in a future life after this one, etc. and so on. I mean, you're probably broadly familiar with the tenets of Christian theology, and there are other theologies are also available. There's a Buddhist one which has its own set of priors about which you either believe or don't believe, but they're not amenable to rational dissection.
Well, sacred beliefs.
Yeah, sacred beliefs.
You're not supposed to dissect it because the whole thing falls down.
Yeah, I mean, if you're going to think about why we do what we do, you need some basic blocks to think with.
Yes.
Otherwise, you're just flailing around in a mess. So a theology, I suppose you could understand a theology as the blocks that you use to think with about why we do what we do. Yeah. And I've spent, I suppose, a lot of my writing recently has been about trying to understand what the blocks are that woke theology, or what cyborg theology, if you like, is using to think with.
Yeah.
And some sort of tentative thoughts I have about that are that it's different from the metaphysics, or most of the metaphysical orders that, the Christian one or the Buddhist one, for example. It's distinct from those in asserting that we don't need moral blocks to think with because we can use technology instead.
The basic story of technology in our lifetimes is how it's given us the power to express ourselves and experience the world with ever greater richness. Back when I started Facebook, that mostly meant text that we typed on computers. Then we all got phones with cameras, and the internet became much more visual. And recently, as connections got faster, video has become the main way that we experience content. We've gone from desktop to web to phones, from text to photos to video, but this isn't the end of the line. The next platform and medium will be even more immersive, an embodied internet where you're in the experience, not just looking at it. And we call this the metaverse. And you're going to be able to do almost anything you can imagine.
It's fundamentally an attempt to liberate us from having to be governed by limits of any kind whatsoever, whether those are physical or social. It's an attempt to free us from being governed, even by the limits of having bodies. You could look at something like the metaverse, or really the internet in general, whether it's fully realized kind of alternate realities, or the kind of the overlaying of the existing reality with internet ones, Twitter and so on. Those are all efforts to liberate us from the bounds of having bodies.
In many ways, they pave the way for that kind of thinking.
Absolutely. I mean, you and I know each other through the internet, so to that extent, we're creatures of the cyborg age very much, every bit as much as as the wokest of the woke. And there are a great many things that I like about it. I mean, I'm a sort of recovering Gnostic, I suppose you could say. I think if you'd offered me a chance to, escape the limits of my own body as a teenager and live entirely in a kind of virtual world, I'd have bitten your arm off. I still find it incredibly difficult to stay where I am. Yeah. This is a live difficulty for me all the time. I'm as smartphone addicted as anybody else. I have to make a conscious effort to put the damn thing away and go for a run or be present with my family. And I don't think it's any coincidence that the real uptick in trans identity coincides with smartphones becoming ubiquitous. I think that's absolutely, there's a very strong causal link. And it's very clear that a lot, especially of young girls who embrace that and try and transcend the limits of their own embodied sex, are inspired to do so by influencers and really the experience of socializing in a disembodied way. If you've been interacting with other people in Minecraft since you were 5, then is it any wonder that you believe you can edit your meat avatar the way you can edit your virtual one? I don't think it would self-evidently be a matter of basic social justice to people, normalized into that paradigm. Yeah. To imagine that this is something that you can and should be able to do.
So what is it grounded in then? It's I guess it's
technology. The technology is our theology.
But
now.
It's also nothing.
The bits and you need a certain mental outlook. You need a certain understanding of what the world is to think about it technologically. I mean, I'm not gonna digress into Martin Heidegger, but I strongly recommend The Question Concerning Technology, which is an essay he wrote in the mid-20th century about the technological mindset, which, I mean, I'm paraphrasing wildly. He's a very distinctive writer, but paraphrasing what he says, he describes how, to understand what technology is, we have to understand what that way of looking at the world is. And as he sees it, the technological mindset is about turning the world from being whatever it is into being a resource that can be used.
Okay.
And which automatically means you just tune out some aspects of what a thing is and think about it only in terms of the way it can be used. I mean, if we're sitting in this cute house, and outside there's a coop with some chickens in, right? Yeah. I have chickens at home. You can spend a lot of time observing chickens and the way they interact with each other and their little chickeny social order and the way they scratch and peck, and they're kind of basic but also kind of endearing creatures. You can spend plenty of time kind of contemplating the chickenness of a chicken if you want to. But if you're a factory farmer, that's not how you look at chickens at all, right? You look at them as production units. You look at them as units of egg production or units of meat production, which must be optimized with the minimal financial input and the maximum output and the maximum profit margin. Rather than looking at the being of a chicken in its chickenness, if you like, you're looking at it as standing reserve, as a resource to be utilised. And from his perspective, that's the technological mindset is just looking at the whole world in that way, as a set of resources that you can use. And I would argue that's what's distinct about the cyborg era is that we've moved from thinking about the material and the animal world in those terms to looking at people in that way as well, and even commodifying ourselves in that way.
I guess this is what I meant before about technology being nothing, because if you're moving towards technology being the ground of everything, then you're moving away from human nature.
Yes, absolutely.
And so my...
I guess remind me to come back to that, because I have a lot more to say about that.
Go on. I don't want to, you're on these beautiful flows, so go. Do your
well,
thing.
I mean, if we're going to talk about the relation between technology and human nature, I mean, another one of my working hypotheses about cyborg theocracy, or the cyborg theology, is that it's one of its fundamental tenets is that there is no such thing.
As a human nature.
There is no such thing as human nature. And in fact, to assert that we have a nature it's racist, it's sexist, it's oppressive. Yeah. It immediately imposes a set of historically oppressive constraints on us that also limits what we what we are or what we could become. Yeah. And that asymmetrically oppresses different classes of people along lines which go all the way back into history. And I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with the argument.
Definitely, yeah. It's essentially just the blank slatist underpinning of the whole thing.
But if you blank slatism, the sort of Rousseau-esque idea that we come into the world perfect and then culture ruins us. If you look at what it does in the context, if you look at what it enables in the context of a high-tech world. If we're blank slates, then in theory, there's no reason, for example, why we shouldn't become cyborgs. There's no reason why we shouldn't why we shouldn't splice human DNA with a pig or a monkey. Why not? I mean, why shouldn't we have skin grafts made of why shouldn't we graft fish skin onto ourselves? Why shouldn't we implant microchips in our brains? Why shouldn't we biohack ourselves? Why shouldn't we genetically optimize embryos?
Organisms are algorithms. This is the big insight of the modern life sciences, that organisms, whether viruses or bananas or humans, they are really just biochemical algorithms. And we are learning how to decipher these algorithms. By hacking organisms, elites may gain the power to re-engineer the future of life itself. Because once you can hack something, you can usually also engineer it. Science is replacing evolution by natural selection with evolution by intelligent design. Not the intelligent design of some god above the clouds, but our intelligent design.
So there's no coherent reason why you shouldn't do any of those things.
What is their theology for a good life in all this? Pleasure, just unmitigated pleasure.
I mean, it depends who you ask, but probably the most coherent theories which are emerging around this are coming out of Silicon Valley thinkers who talk about. I would look in biohacking, long-termism, and effective altruism are probably the most coherent frameworks for thinking about what the good life is in the context of having abolished human nature.
Part of this is the intersectional theory, which is I've been looking very closely at the source material, the grievance studies stuff within academia, and then the activist movement that's built on top of that. To me, that's the narrow definition of woke. But not everyone is liberated inside that movement. It's kind of liberation reparations or a caste system or something like that. So where does the intersectional movement fit into this, in your view?
Where does the intersectional thing fit into all of this? I suppose one way of looking at it might be to say that the intersectional theory is what happens when the aspiration for total liberation underwritten by technology collides with reality.
Yes. Yeah.
Because
I'm oppressed, therefore I am. Because you're in a space of nothingness.
Right. You're in a space of nothingness, and there are no moral values. There's no nothing. and yet it remains manifestly true that no matter how hard we try and liberate people, they stay stubbornly not liberated. You know, we're still governed by the givens of our existence, and so there's this sort of enraged response to that.
Oh my God, I believe in equal rights. Oh my God, I believe that. I don't believe in equal rights. Homophobia shouldn't be allowed. Oh my God, I believe that white men shouldn't dictate a fucking woman's place in the world. You fucking douchebag.
A charitable read we could put on what's going on with, you know, what gets critiqued as wokeness, is that it's a sincere effort and genuinely well-meaning effort by a lot of people to reconcile a profoundly amoral worldview with a desire to make the world better.
I believe deeply in the critical and audacious goal of eliminating racism and violence in our world. I believe we're all privileged to engage in that work in a learning community that wants to be better. And I believe we have the will to do so. Thank you for coming today.
And you come up with this very sort of mechanistic way of grading people according to their oppressions, and this very dehumanizing way of characterizing people according to their intersecting identity classes, and make a sincere effort to make the world a better place based on that framework. And you know, you might call it it's a moral response to a radically amoral situation, or it's an effort to make a moral response to a radically amoral terrain.
So, okay, we can put the intersectional stuff to the side, because that's what I've been looking at very closely, and more I realise that it's only a small part of a bigger thing. So you said the moral order, that kind of points to why you use the word theocracy.
Well, I think it should be clear to everybody by now that we don't live in the liberal age anymore. I mean, the point where you can be banned from the internet for saying that humans can't change sex, even though it's true, is not a liberal age. That's not an age where viewpoint pluralism is meaningfully a thing. And I think we should probably also say that viewpoint pluralism has never really been a thing. But the
pretense.
I think there's been a set of dramatic conventions in place throughout the liberal era which says that there are things that we can all say whatever we want. You know, that's probably actually more recent than we'd like to think. I mean, blasphemy laws were only abolished in the United Kingdom towards the end of the 20th century, I think, and it was less than 10 years before they were reinstated in the form of hate crime laws. All of politics already accepts that state power may legitimately be used to impose a moral framework. And that ought to be, I mean, you say you spent lockdown in Melbourne. And you know, so you've been at the sharp end of state power being used to impose a moral framework.
What motivates you, whether it's care for your fellow Victorian, care for those who are closest to you because you don't want to make them sick, or whether it's about avoiding really considerable fines, and the Chief Commissioner will speak to this in a moment, for all of those reasons and more, we're all in this together whether we like it or not. There are no other options.
Melbourne's abandoned streets are swarming with COVID cops as the Premier's hardline measures come into force.
I was completely isolated with no way to work, and I couldn't even see friends and family at a park because they were outside of a 5-kilometre radius.
High-powered drones will be used to find people not wearing masks and cars too far from home.
There's a man on a girl and you choked her. For what? For a mask? For not having a mask? Look how pathetic you are. She doesn't have a mask. Are you serious?
And censorship was used very overtly and very unembarrassedly.
Now, you're under arrest in relation to incitement.
Incitement? That's fine, can I just
let me finish. Well, it doesn't matter. Any device in this house we're taking.
Authorised by the Australian Government, Canberra.
You know, there are kids who are severely developmentally delayed relative to previous cohorts because they didn't interact with another human being outside their parents for literally for literally the first 2 or 3 years of their lives. You know, there are toddlers, you know, now entering primary school who are radically speech delayed because they didn't see another human being speak for years on end after 12 hours a day in kindergarten with carers wearing masks. You know, I mean, there's an absolute litany of intricately of subtle social and emotional deprivation. You know, and this is really just, this is at the top of the socioeconomic scale. That's long before we get to the children who are trapped for years in houses with volatile or depressed or alcoholic or violent parents, or the children who ended up homeless because their parents lost their livelihoods and still weren't allowed to see or interact or speak with anybody other than that. I mean, this, you know, it's a sort of slow-moving car crash.
One of the, I guess, core tenets of Cyborg Theocracy, we could say, is that there is no such thing as a human nature.
There is no such thing as human nature.
And you need a definition of human nature to then define what a good life is.
Right,
and
absolutely.
So once we can't agree, or there is no such thing as a definition of good life,
then it doesn't matter if you lock all the children in a cupboard for 2 years. It won't matter because there's no such thing as human nature, and children are resilient and they'll adapt. Yeah. Wrong. On the other hand, there are people who would say, well, sure, but you know, the dangers of COVID are also unevenly distributed. And is it how do you weigh Granny's life against a generation of speech-delayed children? You know, and the answer is you can't. You know, not without a moral framework. And the thing is, we've been methodically abolishing our moral framework in favour of moral relativism plus technology. And so, is it any wonder that we ended up responding to this, what was fundamentally a moral panic, or you know, a set of tragic choices that had to be made about how we were going to deal with this pandemic? Is it any wonder that we tried to respond with money and machines and never really got to grips with the moral issues, the inevitability of death, you know, the certainty of tragic choices, you know, and the fundamental brokenness of the human condition, the fact that this was going to be a shit sandwich for everybody. Yeah. And everybody was going to have to take a bite, and it was just a question of who took which bites and in what order. And somehow we thought we could defy gravity just through the medium of money and machines, and it's not true, and it will never be true.
Can we now move on to some who questions? So who are the saints, inquisitors, and clergy of the Cyborg Theocracy?
This is where it gets really radioactive.